Hello, everyone. I want to start this talk by asking you to imagine a slightly different reality. I want you to imagine that all of the election security measures that the security community had advocated for years were in place. Risk limiting audits in every state, every vote cast using voter verified paper ballots, and widespread independent security testing. My question to you is, would the public's confidence in the election be any different? I would argue that we'd not see a sizable increase in trust. To those of us who understand these methods, we'd certainly have more confidence. But to a large percentage of the population who are already inclined to believe conspiracy theories and spurious claims, supposed security guarantees by security experts don't hold much more credence than the current statements by election officials or security experts. What's more, many of the claims made about this election could not be disproven by these security measures. If dead people are voting, which they're not, paper ballots and risk limiting audits wouldn't catch that. And if there's a conspiracy wide enough to implant software in all states to change results of votes, which again is bogus, surely the election officials could also lie about audited results. Indeed, in many of the most contentious states, best practices are already in place. Georgia and Michigan both conducted full risk limiting audits with voter verified paper trails. Georgia conducted a full hand recount of ballots. Antrim County, Michigan, the home of vote changing conspiracies, confirmed its results in the zero limit risk limiting audit. So if the public does not trust election results, even when scientific evidence proves that they are valid, does this mean that all election security efforts are in vain? After all, if the goal of an election is to convince a loser that they lost, and the loser happens to be inconvincible, can any amount of evidence increase the public's confidence in the election? I would argue that, to the contrary, having proof is immensely important, but we need to go further than that. It's not just enough to have the proof, but we must work actively to ensure that the public is confident in the results of the election. So what does this mean in practice? We have to focus on the entire spectrum of the election, what I call in the title of this talk, the full stack of election security. Election security is more than just voting machines. Election security encompasses the security of election support systems, like voter registration databases, election night reporting, electronic poll books, because if an adversary compromises any one of these technologies, then trust in the election is lost, even if votes themselves aren't changed. Election security also involves campaigns, like we saw in 2016, because if a sophisticated adversary can compromise a campaign and leak down to materials, this can truly damage that campaign strategy going forward and result in the public not knowing who to trust. Election security also involves mis and disinformation because an adversary who's able to convince the public that election results are unfair, as happened this election with domestic actors, has undermined the results of the election. We must consider all of these aspects of election security as a whole if we want to improve both the security of elections and people's confidence going forward. So in the remainder of this talk, I'm going to walk you through areas for improving each of these components of the full stack of election security. If there's one takeaway from this talk, it should be that in order to achieve full stack security, the parts must work in tandem. It's not enough just to combat disinformation, for instance, in isolation, but rather we must build on the work to secure the election infrastructure in order to combat claims about supposed election irregularities. I'll start with the election infrastructure itself. The average person might think of just voting machines as the election infrastructure, but there's really a wide range of technologies deployed, any of which could affect trust in the election if compromised. First, the voting process. This is where the vast majority of research has been focused and where we've seen the most progress. We've had advances in basic areas such as requiring voter verified paper trails in most states for voting machines, as well as the deployment of risk limiting audits to turn these paper trails into proof that the election result was most likely correct. Further, development of properties such as end-to-end verifiability have provided means to give voters proof that their votes were correctly cast and that the tallied result is valid. Increased availability of software such as Microsoft's Election Guard has made it easier for any election official to run an end-to-end verifiable advances. These are all truly great advances and we should be celebrating them, but there's more work to be done. We must continue working to deploy these systems and focus on making them usable. Further, as evidenced by this past election, in-person voting alone cannot suffice. We must aim to provide these same guarantees in remote settings, such as mail-in voting. Being able to do this would have the added benefit of helping to refute criticisms of voter fraud made about remote voting systems. Of course, when we're talking about remote voting, there's also internet voting, everyone's favorite topic. We should be having a nuanced conversation here. We cannot do internet voting securely today, as evidenced by recent studies from the MIT, as well as one they did with the University of Michigan. This is not to say that with sufficient research, it won't be possible years or decades in the future. And we can't deny that there are benefits of internet voting, such as potentially increased turnout and convenience during the pandemic. Research into internet voting, by necessity, would tackle hard problems in computer security, such as combating malware and accessible authentication methods. We should explore these areas, and if we are somehow able to solve enough to make internet voting secure, acknowledge that would be fantastic. Of course, these are all research level problems and we are a long way away from solving them, but that doesn't mean that we can't work on them and can't try to make it work. Further, we need to be accepting that in the meantime, we need to make voting methods accessible to everyone, and this includes in remote settings. Systems such as remote accessible vote by mail, by which a voter receives their ballot online, can mark it online, but return it physically through the mail, allow a middle ground where we can still have integrity of the elections because there's a paper ballot and the voter can check that, but we can also improve accessibility in these remote settings. Okay, so moving to election support systems, such as voter registration databases, election night reporting websites, electronic poll books, we have a whole host of systems that are less studied, but I would argue equally important. Part of the reason that they are less studied may be that they appear, well, boring at first glance. Voter registration database is a database, and I thought we solved SQL injection 15 years ago. Election night reporting is a static website, and we've known about public key cryptography to sign those results for 40 years. First, it's clear that what currently exists just isn't working. In 2016, we saw targeting of all 50 states' voter registration databases. Russians breached 2 states, including Illinois, my home state, and Arizona. Indeed, when I was registering to vote in 2018, 2 years later in Illinois, I noticed that the SQL injection vulnerability still hadn't been patched. Although they were able to fix it once I told them about it, it's clear that we still have a long way to go if we want for these systems to be truly secure. Part of the problem is that there's little to no public scrutiny of most of these systems. The Election Assistance Commission's certification process, which itself does have many flaws, doesn't cover election support systems. And with little published research on these systems, we really don't have any idea what's going on under the hood. Election night reporting is another area that could have wide-ranging effects in public confidence, even if the actual results aren't changed. What we see here is Antrim County, Michigan, which we saw in 2020 had effects on public confidence when an administrative error led to incorrect reporting of results. While errors like this can't be prevented, it's clear that a deliberative attack on such systems would affect public confidence. We can work to improve the security of these systems, as well as educate the public that the results that they see on election night aren't official results. To combat this and other risks to election support systems, we desperately need public security research. This can be difficult when it might not even be possible for a security researcher to get their hands on them. One way to solve this would be requiring that all such systems are open source, which would allow public scrutiny and hold vendors accountable. A lot of the trouble with election support systems isn't that we don't know how to do it securely, but just that they aren't done securely in practice. A lot of this is an exercise in making the right technology and security measures available to election officials. Election officials shouldn't have to reinvent the wheel. Rather than hosting their own mail servers, which many of them do, they could rely on commercial products like Gmail, which has better security than they could ever obtain themselves. These platforms have done a commendable job in making their services available to these entities. We should continue aiming to expand both the breadth and depth of these services offered so that election officials can choose from secure technology out of the box and be able to improve the security of their election support systems. Okay, so moving to campaigns. This is also an area where we've seen large attacks. Shown to the right here is the phishing email that was sent to John Podesta in 2016, which stemmed arguably the largest foreign interference campaign in United States history. Podesta's clicking of this link allowed Russian hackers to access and leak thousands of emails related to the Clinton campaign, which received widespread media coverage. Campaigns today remain the largest unknown on election security, since campaign security continues to be shrouded in secrecy. What I can say is that we need to change this security. Campaign security must be viewed as nonpartisan. Any compromise of a campaign is an attack on American democracy itself, regardless of political affiliations. And just as transparency with voting systems and election support systems can improve their security, so can transparency in the security of political campaigns improve their security going forward. Imagine if a campaign was able to share data that they received with other campaigns and were able to see common threats and able to defend against these together. I think we'd be in a much better state. So let's work on viewing campaign security as nonpartisan and allowing campaigns to work with each other as well with trusted bodies such as the federal government and other companies that seek to help in order to truly improve their security going forward. Media also definitely has a role to play here. When the Russian military started leaking emails through WikiLeaks in 2016, media outlets were quick to cover them widely without leading with the potentially nefarious nature behind the leaks. Though media has improved its practices somewhat, such as with the coverage of the Hunter Biden emails in 2020, there's still much room to improve in creating well-defined practices around leaked information. Campaigns could also commit to, for instance, not relying on leaked information of their competitors in order to advance themselves. Finally, we have the problem of public confidence. Elections are only valid when people believe them, and mis and disinformation poses an existential risk to democracy. This can be foreign or domestic. We saw large attention towards Russian disinformation in 2016, but the story in 2020 was largely domestic. Indeed, the damage done by domestic actors this past election was magnitudes larger than a foreign adversary could ever hope to achieve. In the face of widespread mis and disinformation, election officials had to become experts not only in running elections, but also in convincing the public that they were accurate in the wake of false information. This is where technical election security measures came to our aid. What we saw in 2016 was election officials pointing to measures the election security community had been talking about for years, paper ballots, risk-weighting audits, and others, in order to debunk rumors floating around. One place where we saw this was CISA's rumor control website, which was one of the most viewed government websites around the election time and contained technical reasons why certain election security rumors just didn't hold any weight, because we had proof with, for instance, paper ballots, a robust chain of custody, that the election results could be trusted. Well, it's clear that a large percentage of Americans still did not believe the results. This was a useful case study in seeing how election security measures can be leveraged to help make the case to a disbelieving public that the results were indeed fair. By expanding technical security measures, as I discussed earlier, we can increase the number of examples that election officials can point to and the efficacy of their debunks. It can be useful to think of mis and disinformation as a problem of supply and demand. We've seen actions that could be taken both on the supply side and the demand side. On the supply side, we've seen recently platforms take action to downrank or even deplatform certain users, as well as placing, for instance, interstitials to suggest to users that the information they're sharing may be false or misleading. The election has also validated the role of institutions in protecting our democracy. From the election officials who maintain the integrity of their elections, the state lawmakers who vote to certify the results, judges who tossed out bogus cases, and federal agencies who debunked floating rumors, it's clear that these institutions can withstand an attack on democracy. As part of this, it was also crucial for election officials to be providing trusted information to their constituents and for media outlets to relay these debunks in order to set the record straight. So these are all actions that can be taken on the supply side, and we've seen some limited effectiveness in at least reducing the gravely potential impact of many of these disinformation narratives. Tackling the demand side is much more long-term, but I would argue that's equally important. We now have a problem in this country where individuals aren't just spreading disinformation, but people actively want to hear them. This is a tough problem, and we need to look to areas such as media literacy or increased civics education to reduce people's susceptibility and desire to hear this type of information. Clearly, we still have a long way to go with disinformation, and we need research to guide this fight. On January 6th, 2021, we saw the real-world impact of months of disinformation spread by political elites. Social media platforms' retroactive actions came too late to prevent the damage already done. One major question is, what forms of actions can platforms take to effectively limit the real-world impact of disinformation? With the recent deplatformings, it's to be seen whether some of this disinformation simply fizzles out or whether it moves to other platforms, which will also need to be monitored. One certainty, however, is that the problem of disinformation extends well beyond social media. We now have an incredibly polarized social media political environment, and a significant portion of Americans are inclined to believe false narratives in order to further their political cause. We need to critically evaluate what has led to this and take measures to stop this, such by investing in reducing the demand for disinformation with civics education or media literacy. All right, so we've laid out different actions of different aspects of an election that need improving. My final point is that these are achievable. We need to look no further than the past successes the election security community has had in order to see that improvement is possible. We had a significant increase in the number of ballots cast with the paper trail in 2020, upwards of 90%, and election officials are increasingly deploying systems like risk-limiting audits to improve voters' confidence in results. We must then work to apply these past successes to other areas of elections, even if they appear boring. Even then, a large part of this still requires applying known security measures to build these systems. We need to either build these ourselves or ensure that the proper incentives exist for voting companies to deliver more secure technology. A good starting point is election support systems, where we've seen that current deployed systems just don't meet the bar. Let's work with election officials to understand where their greatest challenges are and develop technologies that can alleviate security risks. With voter registration databases, for example, can we build a voter registration database that's truly verifiable, allowing voters to know for certain that they're registered and preventing widespread attacks? That remains to be answered, but we can only know if we start working on it. We should also strive to engage in public research. Election vendors and states have finally begun to open their doors to public research under standard vulnerability disclosure policies. These are policies that we've seen in other industries for years, and we've started to normalize the idea of having vulnerabilities, acknowledging where your weaknesses are, and working to fix them. The crucial component of these vulnerability disclosure policies is that they define a scope that researchers can test, which many of them are any public-facing infrastructure of that company, or in the case of, for instance, Ohio, the state. They also give legal protection to researchers so that they can be confident that testing these systems will not lead to legal action, which we have seen instances in the past with voting companies taking legal action against researchers. And finally, they allow publicly disclosing vulnerabilities after a certain time frame, which is arguably the most important to foster a culture of accountability for vulnerabilities found in election systems. The next step here is to make vendor systems publicly available and then start public research into these systems. With forums like the DEF CON Voting Village, we've already started doing this, and we can further strengthen this by involving the vendors and involving the election officials in the fight to make these systems more secure. So with all of this, election security is a problem that can only be solved by working together. Security experts, election officials, lawmakers, social scientists, election vendors, and others must collaborate together in order to fully approach the problem. Election security is a full stack problem. We need to take a full stack approach to fix it. Thank you, and I can now take questions.